Hi, this is Growing Up Aspen with Andy Collin and Chris Pomeroy, and our new podcast, Movie Chat, with some students that we grew up with that got into the film, entertainment, commercial world, and we're here to talk about our experiences and how Aspen pushed us in our direction. Today, we are here with Ivan DeWolf, who went from local sculptor in high school to working in special effects in the film industry for movies like Pirates of the Caribbean. Cool. Well, I'm actually glad you decided to do this because you're in the effects arena, and that's a whole nother part of film that
Yep.
a lot of
Post.
people. It's the quiet part, but it's the
Yeah.
part that sells the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of funny. In visual effects, like, well, depending on what your personality, but for me, a lot of the stuff that I'm most proud of are effects you'd never know were in the film.
Right, right.
It's like if
Yeah,
I do
I
my
remember.
job right, you don't know I exist.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
exactly.
remember years and years ago, you were talking about doing, I think a waterfall or something, and
Yeah.
I remember. Yeah, I remember it was for a
I was doing
movie.
a lot of water, a lot of ocean surface splashes, and
Yeah, I think you were parting the Red Sea.
okay, yeah.
What movie was that for?
Prince of Egypt.
Prince of Egypt. Yeah,
Yeah.
I had a
yeah.
I had a friend, Webster Colcord, who was a Vinton's animator at Vinton's. He got in there when he was like 18, right out of high school. They
Hmm.
snapped him up, and he's now working for Tippett Studios.
Okay.
And he did the spiders in The Matrix
Uh-huh.
because he did the spiders in Minority Report.
Okay.
And so in I think it was two or three after they saw Minority Report, they're like, "Oh, we need you for the spiders." So
It's funny. I have a lot of people that I've talked to that are going into visual effects, and I warn them. It's like whatever it is that you do, the very first thing that you do is probably something that you'll wind up doing the rest of your career. So try and make sure the first thing you do, because like one of the very first projects I ever worked on, I was in art school, and we worked on. It was actually a CD-ROM video game, which is
uh-huh.
just
Yeah.
sort of dates the project.
Yeah.
But it was basically video clips that would run from a CD-ROM, and then you'd make a
Yeah.
choice, and then you'd see clip, A, B, or C, and move the story forward. But it was based on this hotel that was floating on an iceberg in the ocean, so I had to do oceans,
Uh-huh.
and you flash forward like 2 decades, I'm still doing oceans. It's pretty funny
Yeah.
and water and splashes and explosions and
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean when I was a little kid, you guys probably remember this. I was like obsessed with and fascinated by the special effects makeup stuff of the 80s, all the
Yeah.
mechanical
Yes.
monsters and stuff. Rick Baker and
Rick
Dick
Baker,
Smith and
yes.
Rob Bottin and all of the Stan Winston and all those, back when he was doing Dead and Buried back in the early days.
Yeah.
That stuff fascinated me. The obvious follow through from that, and when I was in art school, I was studying sculpture and, I was doing like pretty realistic sculpture with oil-based clay and, very anatomy centric work that would obviously land me in character animation, but that's not what I wound up doing at all. I
Right.
wound up falling into being a specialist on dynamic simulations of natural phenomenon, which is very math heavy. And I never took calculus, but I use it every day.
Well,
So,
Yeah.
that's it's funny where what we went through when we were kids because it felt like uh, your journey starts uh, in the schoolroom, and then you decide to take your own journey. Obviously, the teachers
yeah.
have their idea.
Well, yeah, I had a lot of conflict with the faculty. I actually recently,
Yeah, I
it's kind of funny.
know.
I pretty recently have found out when I was a kid, they were like, well, maybe this kid's autistic or something. So they gave me, this was the 80s. So it was like really
Right.
pretty early on when they had starting to have this concept of there being a spectrum. Because, in the 70s, autism was those kids that were nonverbal. That was it.
Hmm.
And then they started to understand that maybe there's people who are like slightly autistic. And this was like in the 80s, in the early
Yeah.
days. So like, oh, well, the first thing to check is let's see if he, tests on how he tests on an empathy test. And I was like off the chart, very high levels of empathy. And they're like, oh, well, he's not autistic then. But very recently, they have started, there's a new autism spectrum disorder. I hate that term disorder. It's not
Yeah, I
really
know.
necessarily a disorder, but
Yeah.
it's called pathological demand avoidance. And one of the marks of it is that the people who have this generally test very high on tests of empathy. So it has a lot of things that are contraindicative of
Yeah.
classical autism. So I think it's very likely that that is a good fit for what I went through. But I had real conflict with especially with the math teacher, especially with Bart Pepitone. Man, that
Yeah,
man hated
Pepitone,
me. Ooh.
Pepitone, man, it was weird. Nobody in. I talked to Ian, I talked to Olivier, I talked to Mark, and every single person talks about they felt so shitty about how Pepitone treated you.
Yeah, he didn't understand me at all, was the
Yeah,
thing. I was fascinated with the math. I love the math. The truth to it, the underlying reality, that fascinated me.
yeah,
And he expected us to go in there and do the work for him. And
yeah.
I absolutely did not want to do the work for him. You know, and he also really believed, I think he really believed that I just was, a little bit stubborn and I just needed to be broken like a horse.
Right,
But
right.
again, this dovetails back into this pathological demand avoidance. As the name implies, one of the main features is for me at least, and this varies from people. For me, anything that was phrased as an order that I was told to do, I would immediately shut down and would be unable to do it. So, and even if I wanted it, so if you told me, you must eat that cake, I would not be able to force myself to eat that cake. It was not something that I had control of. It wasn't that punk rock like, hey, fuck you, I'm not doing what you tell me. I had no control over it. I just would
Right.
shut down, and I didn't understand what the fuck was going on. So I remember one year, Bart was always on me about the homework, and I literally never did any homework for that man ever.
Yeah, yeah.
But he was on, and like I don't know, it was middle school, it's probably like I don't know, sixth grade or something.
Right,
And I was like, I'm gonna do like beginning of the semester. I'm like, I'm gonna do the first homework assignment. I'm gonna be good on this year. Everything's gonna go well this year. I'm gonna do this. And so I opened up the book to the first chapter, the math book to the first chapter, and I'm looking at the math at the problems, and I got pencil and paper, and I'm ready to go, and I just I couldn't get myself to do it. So I was like, all right, fine, fine. I'm going to do tomorrow's homework. So I flipped forward in the book and I finished tomorrow's homework. Then I go back to the first page and I just shut down. I just couldn't do it. So I go to the next day 3, day 4.
yeah.
I finished the book that night. I finished the
Wow.
entire semester of math that night, but I could not do that day's homework. I showed
Interesting.
up the next day with no homework done, and Bart's like, "Get out of my class," you know. And
Yeah.
it was, so he had it in his head that he could break me, when in fact that was the wrong thing. I could not be broken. I would have taken a bullet before I would have broken. And it wasn't it's not because I'm stubborn. I actually had no control over it.
Right,
That's
right. Well,
just the
That's
way it was.
interesting.
it's
Yeah.
in the public high school, which you didn't go to.
No, no.
There was another teacher, and
Uh-huh.
that was Bob Simons, and
Uh-huh.
he had the same. He was a mental. He was definitely military. He'd come from that aspect, and he
Yeah.
really pushed it. And I felt like that was one of the methods that was old school. The
Yeah,
world was
very definitely.
changing, and they were being left behind.
Yeah, well, Bart really, I mean, Bart and it was bad chemistry because you absolutely could not break me, but you
Yeah,
could totally teach me math. And
right.
I actually understood the math well enough that there were times that the other students were asking me to explain it because Bart wasn't explaining it as well as I did,
You're right. Or in
which
their
only
language.
made things worse,
Yeah.
of course. So yeah, it was a real problem. So I wound up, I mean, it's a real frustration. I'm very good at math. I'm very
Right.
good, especially like four-dimensional, like some very, obscure vector calculus things, and but I was not unable to pursue them scholastically
Uh-huh.
because I was unable to please faculty members in a way that allowed me to pursue that academically.
Right.
So I
Right.
wound up in art school,
Right.
which
Right.
I have a unique talents to as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I can paint like a photograph if I want to. It's just a matter of effort.
Well, you like me were selling sculptures at galleries when you were a kid. I mean,
Yeah,
there's a
yeah.
few of us that did that.
Yeah, and I still love playing with clay. There's something about like clay, like drawing. I find a bit, to be honest, I find a little frustrating. It's a struggle. But
Right.
clay, there's just something very like trying to make clay look like flesh is just a relaxing and always a productive thing for me. So I
Uh-huh.
like that very much.
It feels like therapy for me. You're
Yeah,
sitting there, you're thinking, you're doing stuff. It's almost meditative in a way.
yeah. Yeah, it's like I notice the problem, I fix the problem. I know how to fix the problem. I
Right.
move forward. And it
Right.
just is this process that's just kind of it flows and it just like makes you feel like you're productive and something is coming out the other end. But
Right.
yeah,
I
Right.
it's
kind of
fun.
went the other route on the drawing and printmaking stuff. And Yeah, I think I had one sculpture class, and we were working with a piece of wood, which is hilarious because I do woodworking now. And I did not care for that in college. So, everybody had this smoothed out piece of rosewood ball or something, and they're like, notice the contours. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. Just gonna go draw something. Probably you.
Thanks for listening to Growing Up Aspen's movie chat podcast with Chris Pomeroy and Andy Collin and Ivan DeWolf. And we'd like to thank the Aspen Times and the Aspen Daily News for letting us use material for our book, Growing Up Aspen, Adventures of the Unsupervised, which you can get at twistandturnpress.com or any local bookstore. Thanks.